In the last week, the Detroit Journalism Cooperative invited the leading gubernatorial candidates from both parties for extended interviews. 6 of those 7 gubernatorial candidates recently came to Detroit Public Television studios to be interviewed by the Detroit Journalism Cooperative. The DJC includes Detroit Public TV, Bridge Magazine, Michigan Radio, WDET Radio, New Michigan Media, and Chalkbeat Detroit. DJC journalists spent an hour with each candidate, including the Republicans, State Senator Patrick Colbeck, Dr. Jim Hines, and Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley. And the Democrats, former State Senator Gretchen Whitmer, former Executive Director of the Detroit Health Department Abdul Al-Sayed, and entrepreneur Shri Tanadar. We talked about a variety of issues, including taxes, the roads, water in Line 5, Flint's recovery, immigration, regional transit, marijuana, the redistricting ballot proposal, and a lot about education. We even asked each candidate what kind of car they drive. You might have noticed one face missing in the interviews. State Attorney General and Republican candidate Bill Schuette chose not to participate, despite numerous invitations and scheduling options. Support for the production of the Detroit Journalism Cooperative interviews came from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, and you can see them all online at MiWeek.org. And we encourage you to take a look at those interviews. You know, it's getting close for the candidates now. The Detroit News just put out their endorsements. So let's bring in our MiWeek contributors for some perspective. Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson of WDET Radio. Guys, it's getting close.
It is.
We've seen a lot of ads.
Less than 3 weeks.
Some ads. Right?
Yeah.
No, the ads are almost nonstop now.
Are they?
Yeah, you don't watch TV.
I don't have cable.
Well, that's an entirely different. That is an entirely different topic.
So you're seeing ads from like New Jersey.
Yeah, right. You know, I was really surprised to see the Detroit News endorse Patrick Colbeck and Shri Tanadar. I didn't see that coming, Nolan.
That was the line of the night. That was the line of the night that Stephen actually texted all 3 of us. So you guys have endorsed it. No, the Detroit News endorsed Gretchen Whitmer on the Democratic side and Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley on the Republican side, which might raise a couple of eyebrows coming from the Bill Schuette camp of he's the front runner.
Well, you don't endorse based on who's the front runner. You endorse based on a lot of different things. We felt like we had 2 solid Republican candidates to choose from. We went with Brian Calley because we supported the governor's agenda for 8 years. We think it's been a remarkable results over these 2 terms, and we believe Brian Calley has been a good apprentice, a good lieutenant to him, and has the best hope of carrying on what we think is a very good strategy for Michigan.
I think what was very interesting in the endorsement that Detroit News put out, acknowledging that his campaigning style has been a little too quiet and he hasn't been as politically savvy as he needs to be in this race. But when we sat down with him with the Detroit Journalism Cooperative and he came in for an hour, the depth of his knowledge and was right there, and I really do encourage people to go ahead and take a look at it. But I think maybe that hasn't really translated all the time for him on the campaign trail, Stephen.
He's not a big personality the way Bill Schuette, for instance, is.
A natural politician.
Yeah, I mean, Bill Schuette walks into a room and makes sure that he talks to everybody in that room, and I sort of feel like he's got a little bit of that Bill Clinton dynamic of wanting to make sure that he's got everybody in the room before he leaves, and that's really important.
And it's smart. I mean, I said on Mackinac, watching Bill Schuette and Brian Calley in action, the folks come home from Mackinac saying, I met Bill Schuette.
And I talked to him, right.
And I talked to him. They came home saying, I saw Brian Calley because he could walk from one end of the porch and not stop and shake a hand. And that I think explains why he's lagging in this race.
I don't know how much this figured into.
We were impressed, as you were, by his grasp of the issues and this promise of carrying on what we think is a successful governorship.
I think what was interesting also that you put in there, and I want to get your take on this, Stephen, is kind of ratcheting down the extreme right, extreme left conversation and looking towards, well, maybe that Brian Calley has more of a centrist view that can unite people. What do you think about that? They put that.
Well, I mean, I think there's no question that's one of the strong questions in this race is, will Bill Schuette's full-throated, aggressive embrace of Donald Trump and all of the things that are going on without even distinguishing? I mean, one of the things that I've been really disappointed about Bill Schuette is his inability to bring himself to criticize the legitimately crazy stuff that Donald Trump is saying. I mean, I think it'd be fine to say I like some of the policy things he's doing, but I think he's inappropriate. He won't even bring himself to say that, and I do think that's going to play a role in some of the voting that happens during the primary. I don't know how much that figured into your calculus here, but it was obvious.
What we said about Brian Calley is that we believe at a time, very divisive time, he would be better able to speak to all of Michigan. I would be interested to see what Schuette does if he gets through the primary in the general election, because I don't think you can campaign as defensively of Trump in a general as you do in a primary. I think you're going to see that in races all over the country, people weighing that dynamic. Right now, Trump's still got 80+% of support amongst the Republican Party.
Yeah.
You've got to campaign that way in a primary, just as the Democrats have to go crazy left as they've been going because of this Bernie base that is pulling them. It'll be interesting to see how both parties manage to campaign to the vast middle in the general election, because they certainly haven't in the primary.
Quick question for you guys. When do we usually see the last polls in terms of number-wise before?
We're seeing fewer overall this time, I think, than we did 8 years ago.
Right.
That's because people have less money.
Well,
to be on commission,
and because polls have been disappointing.
Well, it's harder and harder to do it. If you don't do it enough, you get sloppy and out of practice, and the numbers don't mean as much. I would expect we'll see one in the next 2 weeks, right before the primary.
I would hope.
But who knows what it will show.
Let's talk a little bit about the endorsement of Gretchen Whitmer on the Democratic side. I mean, you've had 3 people running very hard there, and when Gretchen sat down and spoke with us, with the DJC, she's very passionate about a lot of things. Again, putting education. We spoke to her a long time about that, and of course, infrastructure. Not just the roads. Only her catchphrase has been caught on by everybody.
I don't like that.
You don't like the catchphrase?
No, I think it's her trying to be folksy, and she's not.
Well, neither here nor there. You know it,
Yeah,
and that's the whole thing.
true.
It is getting traction with people. But I think the biggest question surrounding her will be, how are you going to pay for all the things that you do want to do? And I think
tax
that's
the rich,
real.
tax corporations.
Well,
that's the standard answer.
She's not really giving that answer as full-throated as some of the others.
That's why we
No.
picked. That's why we picked with her. It was the best of a mediocre lot, and she was the only one of the 3 who's not a socialist and not so proudly socialist. And plus, she has experience in governing. The other 2 don't have any experience in governing or really in public policy, and she certainly has depth there.
Although I would say that Abdul El Sayed, while I think he's probably a little premature in being in this race at this point, he's the kind of person you want to see do some other stuff. But the way he has articulated an alternate vision of growth, of inclusion, of success, I think has been really, really impressive. Much more impressive than Gretchen Whitmer or Sri Tanadar. And yeah, it sits pretty far to the left, but it is not crazy. The things that he is talking about make a lot of sense. They are things that other states that are far more successful than Michigan are doing. Minnesota being the prime example here in the Midwest. And so the disappointment is that the vessel for that message is a guy who's pretty young, has no political experience, has not run a whole lot of anything in his career, and Gretchen Whitmer, therefore, is a little more qualified.
Let me ask both of you, what do you think the main issue is for Republicans voting and the main issue for Democrats voting in this primary?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, because the economy is bustling along. This should not be a pocketbook year, because if you want a job, you can get a job in this state. Now, I think people are still worried about education, but I think the primary issue is, because of the turmoil we're seeing at the national level and the unease and anxiety it's creating, I think stability and leadership is a primary
I think this
issue.
is a referendum election on the things that are going on at the national level and the direction that the country is headed, not just in terms of its leadership, but in terms of the way in which we deal with each other. This question of how deep the divisions are between people. I think that's one of the prime motivators for people who are going to show up at the poll.
And I do encourage people to go see and listen to the candidate interviews, and you conducted one as well, Nolan. And one of the first questions that we asked every single candidate is, what is your leadership and your management style? And how do you feel that you're going to be able to conduct yourself and work with other people, which I think is going to be key in this next 4 years and who our leader is going to be in the state of Michigan.